CBSN.
Mr. President, at this time, pursuant to Rule 4 of the Senate Rules on Impeachment and the United States Constitution, the President pro tem emeritus, the Senator from Iowa, will now administer the oath to the President pro tem, Patrick J. Leahy.
Please raise your right hand. Your hands on the Bible. Do you solemnly swear that to all things appertaining to the trial of the impeachment of Donald John Trump, former President of the United States, now pending, that you will do impartial justice according to the Constitution and the laws? So help you God.
I do, so help me God. At this time, I will administer the oath to the senators in the chamber in conformance with Article 1, Section 3, Clause 6 of the Constitution and the Senate's impeachment rules. Will all senators now rise and raise their right hand? Do you solemnly swear that in all things appertaining to the trial of the impeachment of Donald John Trump, former President of the United States, now pending, you will do impartial justice according to the Constitution and laws, so help you God? To call the names in groups of 4, senators will present themselves at the desk to sign the oath book.
Ms. Baldwin, Mr. Barrasso, Mr. Bennett, Mrs. Blackburn. Mr. Blumenthal, Mr. Blunt, Mr. Booker, Mr. Bozeman. Mr. Braun, Mr. Brown, Mr. Burr, Ms. Cantwell. Mrs. Capito, Mr. Cardin, Mr. Carper, Mr. Casey. Mr. Cassidy, Ms. Collins, Mr. Coons, Mr. Cornyn.
Molly, if you're still with us, give us some insight into, exactly what is happening here, this sort of procedure, the senators signing in. Once they've been sworn in as jurors, what more will take place today?
So what more will take place today is after they've been sworn in as jurors, the official that was impeached needs to be noticed. They need to get the notification. So what will happen is the Senate will formally send a notification and summon and answer, essentially, the official's response to this impeachment, this article of impeachment. And then after that, they'll set a date by which the former President Trump needs to answer the charges, essentially. And then they'll set a date also for the House managers to respond to President Trump's or former President Trump's official response. So they're basically going to take more procedural actions today and give the formal official notification, and then have the House respond. So we're going through the motions right now at this point. But again, February 8th, that's the day that we really need to look for, because that's when the trial will start.
Now, it's worth reminding our viewers that Democrats will still need the support of 17 Republicans to be victorious in their efforts here. Is that correct?
Yes, it is correct. And that's a very high bar. I'm not sure if they will get 17 Republicans to vote in favor of convicting former President Trump. At this point, again, when you hear the statements that Mitch McConnell has made, saying that former President Trump lied to the American people about the election, and you hear those statements, it's unclear which way Republicans will go. This will be considered a vote of conscience, which really means that the Republican senators will not be asked to vote a certain way, either for or against conviction. But it's still obviously a very difficult vote, because it's something that each senator will have to answer for in his or her state. And again, remember, former President Trump, he may not have won the presidency, but he sure did get a lot of votes, 74 some odd million votes. That's a lot. And he has a lot of supporters out there who will be paying close attention to how their state's individual respective senators vote on convicting or not. And so I believe, and don't quote me on this, Tanya, but I believe even President Biden didn't think that there would be the 17 senators needed to convict President Trump. But again, we still don't know what kind of defense the president will put on. And remember the very unique position that these jurors are in. They actually were victims of this insurrection, because that day on January 6th, all members of the Senate and all members of the House had to be on Capitol Hill, in particular in the Senate, listening to the arguments for and against certifying or against the arguments to contest a respective states' electoral college results. So this is not an issue where only a few senators were in that chamber. They were all there, and now they're all asked to be jurors. So that's why this will be a very unique trial. But impeachment trials in general, they are unique. This isn't like going through the judicial process. It's a very political It's a very political matter, and so that's why it will be fascinating to watch and to see how Republicans end up voting.
Mr. Heinrich.
It will be fascinating to watch. And Molly, has Republican rhetoric around what happened on January 6th changed at all leading up to the trial? I mean, one of the, I guess, arguments against delaying this trial that Democrats were struggling with was the fact that it would give time for some of the anger to cool, because definitely we saw a lot of bipartisan anger over what happened on January 6th. There's no doubt. So have we seen a shift at all in the way Republicans are, framing what happened on the 6th, the way they are, the lens in which they're viewing the president vis-a-vis what happened on the 6th? Has there been a shift?
I have not seen I haven't seen a very big shift in how the senators reacted immediately after the January 6th riot and now. I have a feeling that, or I know that there were senators who had a feeling that the article of impeachment would be coming their way eventually, because there was so much anger in the House and in the Senate. And that kind of lended itself to the possibility of articles of impeachment. So many Republicans, as I said earlier, have been trying to keep their powder dry. And even Mitch McConnell, he has been sort of hinting as to what he's thinking, but he hasn't, again, been whipping up support or opposition to a conviction. And at this point, I think that they really are trying to keep their powder dry. And it will, and this is one of those matters where what Mitch McConnell says he wants to hear the arguments that are made. He wants to hear the legal case that's laid out in front of the Senate in favor of convicting this president and disqualifying him from running for future office. Mitch McConnell genuinely wants to hear those arguments, because there could, as you said earlier, Tanya, it wasn't just that speech on January 6th that incited people to go to the Capitol. There was a lot more that came before it. And depending on the evidence that House Democrats do end up presenting, in addition to those speeches that we saw and the tweets that we've seen, what more evidence they can come up with in terms of a greater movement to take on the Capitol, take on the Article I branch of government. I think that will play a part in how these Republican senators end up voting. So they have been keeping their powder dry. Yes.
I do think, Molly, also it's going to sort of force Republicans into a reckoning that they were probably hoping to kick a little further down the line, which is, what is the Republican Party going to look like post-Donald Trump, correct? I mean, because you have plenty of intellectuals on the right, conservative thinkers who have come out as strong as Democrats saying, the president needs to be impeached over this. But of course, you can argue that those conservatives, from the Lincoln Project, Bulwark, Republicans against Trump, that those aren't the future of the party. But yet, where are those Republicans going to go, right? At this point, there either are going to be a lot of homeless Republicans, or there may be some, rebirth of the Republican Party. It's really hard to say, but it is something that the party is going to have to reckon with rather soon. Don't you agree?
Yes, I do, and I think that one symbol of that, or sort of one outcome of that is looking at Rob Portman, the Republican senator from Ohio, longtime institution who had been in the House for many years, who was former President George W. Bush's OMB director, and he served as the trade ambassador, USTR, has been in the Senate for years, seen as an institutionalist, a very strong, steady hand. He has opted not to run for re-election in 2022. And that has caused many Republicans to sort of look around and say, well, who's going to come in and fill sort of this void of institutionalists who have taken issue with and did take issue with certain things that former President Trump did when he was in the White House, but that the Republican Party in the House and the Senate on the whole did not take issue with President Trump. And I think that there's a number of those individuals in the Senate Republican Party right now who are looking around and saying, well, where do we go from here? And just sort of throwing up their hands and saying, I don't know if it's even worth it to run again, because does
Mr.
feel as if
Marshall,
the Republican Party
Mr.
does have a
McConnell,
reckoning that's going to
Mr.
be coming.
Menendez,
And
Mr. Markley.
again, one thing that former President Trump did do is he brought a lot of people who felt like they didn't have a voice in this country into the Republican Party. But that Republican Party that these people decided to back really centered around President Donald Trump and his policies and his personality. And it was bigger than, say, ideological differences. It had to do with, again, Donald Trump's personality and it is sort of, force of will and of sort of taking on the government, taking on big government and taking on the swamp. Whether that happened or not is a different matter. But President Trump was very good at selling the fight that appealed to many Republicans who ended up joining the party. So you're right. There is going to come a reckoning, and who fills that void is a big question right now for the Republican Party.
And of course, if President Trump is prevented from running again, which unless he is impeached or unless he's removed from office or there is some other action taken against him, there is nothing stopping him from doing that. So you could also argue there are some ambitious Republican senators who might like to have an open field in 2024.
Well, there's a lot of them actually now that you say it. And two of the big names that sort of rise to the top, Josh Hawley and Ted Cruz, and they're sort of vying for that those Trump supporters who came into the party and who voted at a time when perhaps they hadn't done so in the past, and were really energized by this political party. But again, I'm not sure if Ted Cruz or Josh Hawley really has that same kind of oomph that President Trump did. There was something so unique about the former president. He was a showman. What his favorite movie was like The Showman. I think he told Paul Ryan this. In fact, he had all the Republican leaders watch it one time at Camp David. So it was.
Well, don't forget he was a reality star before he ran for president. He was already, a TV celebrity.
Right, and he had this force of personality and this charisma that appealed to everyday Americans who are sick and tired of the same old Washington baloney and malarkey, as President Biden would say, that this sort of swampiness that comes into deal making and sausage making and all that jazz. President Trump sort of came above it. He came from the business world. He had not been a professional politician, and there was something that really appealed to people about that. And people still want that kind of change to come into Washington, D.C., because for better or worse, former President Trump really shook things up when he was in Washington, D.C., and he really changed the way Congress worked with the White House and how they dealt with the White House. And even though they weren't necessarily on top of all the policies that then President Trump would come out with, his people, his White House was in touch with a lot of members on a regular basis.
Mr. Rubio.
Right. The danger, though, about making politics too much about showmanship is then that the substance can sometimes get lost. I thought it was a very interesting point when the first stimulus checks went out. There were several Americans, who saw Donald Trump's name on the check. As you'll remember, when those first stimulus checks went out, the president delayed them just a bit so he could get his name written, which was a controversial thing on the checks. And there were many Americans who either don't follow politics that well or don't, aren't as in the weeds, so to speak, as we are, Molly, who looked at that and actually thought that Donald Trump had written them a personal check. So that just goes to show you that on a certain level, he was brilliant at understanding what it meant to be a populist leader.
Of course. I mean, talk about the ultimate brander. I wish I could have checks that go out that have my name at the bottom of them. To millions of Americans. That would win you a lot of Twitter followers. Well, now he's not on Twitter. That's another issue. But you're right. He is the ultimate he was the commander in chief of branding pretty much, and he was very good at it. And what's going to be interesting to watch in the next few months is how former President Trump kind of emerges from what seems to be a bit of seclusion at this point in Florida, and what he decides to do with this political cachet that he has, because he can use it in a lot of different ways. And I think there are a number of Republicans who are anxiously / apprehensively waiting to see how President Trump uses that personality and that following to either help or hurt the Republican Party. Because one thing that Mitch McConnell was very upset with President Trump about, and this is something I've heard from a number of Senate Republicans, was President Trump's involvement in those Georgia Senate runoff races. Mitch McConnell thought that former President Trump could have been way more involved, could have compelled more people to get to the ballot boxes, and would have kept the Senate Republicans in control. And the president didn't. In fact, what he did was he went back to this narrative and really ruminated over, thinking that the election was somehow stolen, when in fact that Mitch McConnell, for the betterment of the party and to preserve Donald Trump's legacy to a certain extent, should have been out, Mitch McConnell thinks, on the campaign trail, rallying voters to get to the polls so that Republicans could maintain control of the Senate. But President Trump did not do that. And, and that's not to take away from all the work that the Democrats did, because Raphael Warnock, John Ossoff, they worked very, very hard, and there was a dedicated Democratic effort in Georgia. So I don't mean to take that away, but Mitch McConnell, the way that he views it is that President Trump could have done a lot more, and the races could have been more competitive. I'll put it that way.
Right. No, you make a good point, although a lot of Republicans do blame the president for the outcome of the Senate races in Georgia, which you also make the point that, could be unfair blame because, like you said, the Democrats ran a very, very competitive race there as well. So it certainly wasn't anyone's race to lose. Let's put it that way. But Molly, stay with us, please, because I also want to bring in CBS News reporter Melissa Quinn. Her latest article breaks down how an obscure provision of the 14th Amendment to the Constitution has emerged as a possible means of preventing former President Trump from holding federal office in the future. Melissa, welcome. Great to have you with us. So, for our viewers who may not be as familiar with all the amendments of the Constitution, remind us what the 14th Amendment states and which specific provision are you referencing in your article?
Well, thank you for having me. And I think when most people hear about the 14th Amendment, they think about the Equal Protection or Due Process Clause, which guarantees due process and equal protection under the law. The provision that we are specifically looking at here is Section 3 of the 14th Amendment. And what that says is that any person who has sworn an oath to protect or defend the Constitution who engages in insurrection or rebellion is no longer qualified to hold federal office. That phrase, engaged in insurrection or rebellion, is really key here when we're having a discussion about whether President Trump could potentially be prohibited from running for president and seeking the presidency anytime in the future.
So this provision has seldom been invoked over the last 150 years and never against a former president. Melissa, congressional leaders have not expressly said they are considering it. So how likely is it that any Section 3 litigation will actually happen?
Well, you're certainly right that congressional leaders have not explicitly said that they want to apply Section 3. I do think it's important to note, though, that Section 3 was actually referenced in the single article of impeachment that was passed by the House that was delivered to the Senate last night. It was also mentioned in a letter from House Speaker Nancy Pelosi that she sent to her Democratic colleagues January 10th, in which she said, "I am open to your opinions about Section 3. Now, one legal expert that I spoke with said he was pretty confident that we could see action on Section 3, maybe not in the near future, but potentially in 2024 when we get to the next presidential election and the next set of primaries. And he actually said we may be able to expect action from Republican voters. So the way that would work is if a voter in New York State, for example, said that under their state law, a candidate on the ballot has to meet all constitutional qualifications. That voter could go to the state board of elections there in New York and say, I don't believe that a potential candidate, Donald Trump, meets all constitutional qualifications, citing Section 3. The state board of elections then, according to this legal expert, would then have to make a determination whether or not they agree. If the board decided, no, we do not believe that a candidate, Trump, does meet those constitutional qualifications, then the former president could take that challenge to the courts and see whether or not they agree that should stand.
That's very, very interesting. You know, there are some lawmakers who have accused some of their colleagues of having had either something to do with the insurrectionists or be in communication with the insurrectionists. All of this is, of course, under investigation. But could this Section 3 also be used in any of those cases if some evidence does arise that there were any lawmakers who knew a little bit more about the rioters than might appear at first glance?
Yeah, I think that's a really important and unfortunately at this stage an unanswered question. That phrase that I mentioned earlier, engaged in insurrection, is really what this is all going to come down to. You have to look at some of the conduct of some of the lawmakers, thinking about Congressman Mo Brooks from Alabama, for example. Do we know enough about what role he played in the lead up to the events of January 6th to really make a determination that he engaged in insurrection? And same with President Trump. Would we say that his comments on the morning of January 6th, his comments in the run up to the assault on the Capitol, does qualify as engaged in insurrection? And I think that's a question that lawmakers, if they do want to take this route, are going to have to answer.
Right. And Melissa, as you mentioned earlier, history doesn't provide us much guidance on Section 3 beyond the Reconstruction era, and you spoke to a slew of legal experts on this matter. Do they believe there's a viable roadmap and mechanism to enforcing Section 3, or is there simply not enough precedents to go by?
No, they actually think there is a model that Congress could turn to if they wanted to apply Section 3, that being Section 10 of the Voting Rights Act. And here's how that process would work. Congress would first engage in a fact-finding mission in which they looked at all of the events on January 6th, the run-up to January 6th. Then they would make a declaration, potentially through a concurrent resolution, as to whether or not the president did indeed engage in insurrection based on the facts that they identified, and whether or not he is qualified to hold federal office again based, again, on that declaration. Then they would pass legislation.
All right.
That says
Melissa, I'm sorry to interrupt you, but I think we need to go in and listen to what Senator Rand Paul is saying. Let's listen in.
And is not in order.
Under the precedents of the Senate regarding constitutional points of order, including those of the Senate while sitting as a court of impeachment, the chair submits the question to the Senate. Is the point of order well taken?
Mr. President,
The majority leader.
the theory that the impeachment of a former official is unconstitutional is flat out wrong by every frame of analysis: constitutional context, historical practice, precedent, and basic common sense. It's been completely debunked by constitutional scholars from all across the political spectrum. Now, the junior senator from Kentucky read one clause from the Constitution about the Senate's impeachment powers. He left out another from Article 3, Section 2, quote, "Judgment in cases of impeachment shall not extend further than to removal from office and disqualification to hold and enjoy any office of honor, trust, or profit under the United States," unquote. If the framers intended impeachment to merely be a vehicle to remove sitting officials from their office, they would not have included that additional provision, disqualification from future office. The Constitution also gives the Senate, quote, "the sole power to try all impeachments." So what have past Senates decided on this question? In 1876, President Grant's Secretary of War, William Belknap, literally raced to the White House to tender his resignation before the House was set to vote on his impeachment. Not only did the House move forward with the impeachment, but the Senate convened a trial and voted as a chamber that Mr. Belknap could be tried, quote, "for acts done as Secretary of War notwithstanding his resignation of said office. The language is crystal clear, without any ambiguity. The history and precedent is clear. The Senate has the power to try former officials, and the reasons for that are basic common sense. It makes no sense whatsoever that a president or any official could commit a heinous crime against our country and then defeat Congress's impeachment powers and avoid a vote on disqualification by simply resigning, or by waiting to commit that offense until their last few weeks in office. The theory that the Senate can't try former officials would amount to a constitutional get-out-of-jail-free card for any president who commits an impeachable offense. Ironically, the senator from Kentucky's motion would do an injury to the Constitution by rendering the disqualification clause effectively moot. So again, by constitutional text, precedent, and common basic sense, it is clearly and certainly constitutional to hold a trial for a former official. Former President Trump committed, in the view of many, including myself, the gravest offense ever committed by a president of the United States. The Senate will conduct a trial of the former president, and senators will render judgment on his conduct. Therefore, the point of order is ill-founded and, in any case, premature. If senators want this issue debated, it can and will be argued during the trial. Therefore, I move to table the point of order, and I ask for the yeas and nays.
Is there a sufficient second? There is a sufficient second. The clerk will call the roll.
Ms. Baldwin.
Aye.
Mr. Barrasso. Mr. Bennett. Mrs. Blackburn. Mr. Blumenthal. Mr. Blunt. Mr. Booker. Mr. Bozeman. Mr. Braun. Mr. Brown. Mr. Burr. Ms. Cantwell. Mrs. Capito. Mr. Cardin. Mr. Carper. Mr. Casey. Mr. Cassidy. Ms. Collins. Mr. Coons. Mr. Cornyn. Ms. Cortez Masto. Mr. Cotton. Mr. Kramer. Mr. Crapo. Mr. Cruz. Mr. Daines. Ms. Duckworth. Mr. Durbin. Ms. Ernst. Mrs. Feinstein. Mrs. Fisher. Mrs. Gillibrand. Mr. Graham. Mr. Grassley. Mr. Haggerty. Ms. Hassan. Mr. Hawley.
All right, Molly, so just what we discussed earlier has come to pass. Senator Rand Paul is being himself and raised the objection as to whether this trial was constitutional. Senator Schumer said it was, and so now they are voting on whether to proceed, correct?
Yes, and essentially what they're voting on is they're voting on a motion to table Rand Paul's objection. So it's sort of twisted in this way, but an aye vote is in favor of keeping this trial going. A no vote is backing Rand Paul, essentially. So I've been listening, and there have been several Republicans who have voted with Rand Paul, saying that it's unconstitutional, but a number of Democrats, and I can't tell, but there's several Republicans who I would have thought would vote in favor of keeping it going. They may have actually called out their vote, but I couldn't hear it. They might have been using their timid voices, but we'll hear when the reading clerk, the tally clerk, goes through and lists the ayes and the nays.
And will that be the end of the proceedings for the day, or will they do something else procedural after this vote is finished?
Well, again, we have to see how this vote goes. I don't think that this will be a tied vote because I don't see Vice President Harris around. And usually when a tie is going to happen and she's needed to break the tie, she'll be very close by, and I don't see her anywhere close to the chamber. However, after this, like I said, the Senate will create, they will formally notify the former president that he has been impeached. They will ask the House managers to respond to the president's response to the impeachment article, and they'll set the date for the rest of the trial.
All right, and Melissa, are you still with us?
I am, yes.
Would you want to weigh in on what the constitutional scholars you have talked with say about whether it is constitutional to have a trial to remove from office a president who has already left office?
Yes, those that I have spoken with do agree that the Senate can go ahead and proceed with trying former President Trump, particularly because his conduct occurred while he was still in office. I do think it's interesting. This is actually a question that the Congressional Research Service, which a lot of us reporters certainly rely on, did look into. And while the report that they put out did acknowledge that the Constitution is largely silent on this very issue, legal scholars who have looked extensively into this question do agree that the Senate can proceed with its trial.
And Molly, I guess the essential issue here is the piece of keeping him out of office, right? Obviously, he's left office.
Right.
So it's the piece that we heard Senator Schumer say that would prevent him from ever holding office again. It looks like there may be other ways of doing it, though, through the 14th Amendment. Do you think that if Democrats are not victorious here, and there's a very, very good chance they won't be, as we discussed earlier, they need 17 Republicans to vote with them, there may be some other legal methods that they pursue to keep Donald Trump from running for president again?
Well, sure. I think that that they could very well move ahead with the 14th Amendment provision. That's something that Democratic Virginia Senator Tim Kaine had been sort of talking about behind closed doors with his colleagues, trying to feel out some support for that. But again, I think that we're going to have to wait and see what happens at this trial, what evidence is presented, and go from there. That's pretty much where things stand at this point. And, on a separate but related matter, if the Congress does actually move forward and create a 9/11 style commission to look into what happened on January 6th, how it happened, why it wasn't prevented, what actions were taken, which actions weren't taken, that commission could go into sort of the background of the individuals who were involved, what they were motivated by. And I think that after a 9/11 style commission would end, would wrap up its report and offer recommendations based on the evidence that was garnered during that process, the Senate and the House could act at that time as well. It just depends on what evidence is gleaned from the FBI about these groups that were involved, from the DNI and agencies like that, that that really are doing their own after-action reports, but they aren't doing necessarily a comprehensive look at how all those agencies related to each other and what impact the president had and his words had and his sentiments after the November election had on the individuals who took part in that riot in the Capitol.
Right. And Molly, remind us why Chief Justice Roberts will not be presiding over this trial this time around.
You know, that's a good question. And in fact, that's something that Rand Paul said when he got up to stand up to speak. He said part of the reason this isn't constitutional is because the Supreme Court, the Chief Justice of the Supreme Court is not presiding over these proceedings. Well, that is an argument. But again, we have to look at other precedents in terms of the Senate taking on impeachment trials, because there have been a number of impeachment trials of sitting judges and other officials. And at that time, the president pro tem, the pro tempore, as Patrick Leahy is, did sit and preside over those trials. So that's one of the reasons why the Senate is doing that, and it looks like they're moving forward with the trial. There are 55 ayes, 45 nays.
Are you surprised by that count?
I'm not, but I want to see who those 5 yays were, which Republicans crossed over. I have my suspicions, but I won't I won't conjecture right now. Maybe I could put some money on it. I don't know.
President of the United States.
Let's listen in and see what else is being discussed.
There is a sufficient second. The clerk will call the roll.
Ms. Baldwin. Mr. Barrasso. Mr. Bennett. Mrs. Blackburn. Mr. Blumenthal. Mr. Blunt. Mr. Booker. Mr. Bozeman. Mr. Braun. Mr. Brown. Mr. Burr. Ms. Cantwell. Mrs. Capito. Mr. Cardin.
So, Molly, there's another roll call vote going on right now. You want to tell us what the senators are voting on here?
Mr. Cassidy.
So I believe what they're voting on is that next step in the process, again, sending the formal notification to the president and setting the date by which a written response must arrive to the Senate, and also asking for the House impeachment managers to send their written response to the response, and setting the date for the trial. I believe that's what's happening.
Mr. Daines.
And remind us what we can expect. Right. Remind us what we can expect from the impeachment managers.
Well, essentially what they'll do is once former President Trump sends his written response, essentially laying out his defense, the House impeachment managers will then respond. They will reply to whatever the president laid out in his defense. And so they'll provide more evidence that they're going to bring into the trial, perhaps lay out witnesses who will counter what the president has said, has provided as a defense in terms of why he should not be convicted and why he was not responsible for inciting this riot. And we'll see that. But again, it will all culminate in that date that the House managers essentially have to provide their quote unquote reply. That will be on February 8th, when the trial is set to take off, when the trial is set to move forward.
Mr. King. Ms. Klobuchar.
And there are 8 or 9 impeachment managers.
Langford.
This is all organizing, yeah.
Mr. Lee.
And it's interesting because, as we discussed in the first impeachment trial, impeachment managers often make a name for themselves, right? They get a lot of attention, a lot of TV time. So these can be star-making turns for some of these lawmakers.
Mr. McConnell.
Sure, they absolutely can. And if you look at the players that are involved this round, somebody like Eric Swalwell, a Democrat, a House Democrat from California, who was a prosecutor in his days in Walnut Creek in California, who wanted to play a bigger role in the last impeachment, he's involved. Ted Lieu, also a Democrat from California on the Judiciary Committee, former prosecutor, who did also want to be a part of that impeachment trial last year at this time. So essentially you're getting, I don't want to say this, I don't know how to say this in any other way, but sort of like the second string team is coming on. You know, you had your impeachment managers last go around. They took the limelight and they ran with it. Now it's time to give some other House members their turn. And some of these impeachment managers, like Joe Neguse, they have very personal stories to tell, having been under attack. Because again, this is not something that these people are coming to without an opinion on. They were actually part of it. They were the victims of this riot. And it's going to be unusual and interesting to see the case that they make, because so many of them had to leave the House chamber under police escort or had to put on the gas masks in the chamber. And they do have very personal stories about how that riot and insurrection affected them and affected their colleagues and their close confidants. And there is a very diverse team that's coming on, led by Jamie Raskin, who's a constitutional professor and also wanted to be more involved in the impeachment management last go around. And in fact, he actually did sit in for Judiciary Chairman Jerry Nadler in front of the House Rules Committee to lay out the case 1 year ago. Jerry Nadler had an emergency back in New York, and so Jamie Raskin was tasked to take on that role. And that's one of the reasons why we see him in the lead position here for these impeachment managers. He's well versed on the Constitution. Just listen to him in the House Rules Committee. He's also a member of the Rules Committee, and he's quite adept at making constitutional arguments. You can, if you want to take notes and you're in law school, it's a good education in how the law works and the Constitution operates. But Jamie Raskin is taking the lead on this. Stacey Plaskett, who is one of the delegates from the U.S. Virgin Islands, she'll also be part of the team. As I said, Joe Neguse, Ted Lieu, Susan Wild from Pennsylvania, who was also impacted greatly by that riot. She was up in the gallery on the day of January 6th when the members had to put, again, the gas masks on and had to exit quickly from the House chamber. So a lot of different stories behind the impeachment managers and how they bring that experience into this spotlight opportunity for them will be interesting to watch. We'll have to track them.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, Molly Hooper and Melissa Quinn, thanks to both of you for sticking with us through this process on the Senate floor. Again, senators were sworn in ahead of the impeachment trial of former President Trump. We also watched a challenge to the trial on constitutional grounds, which was brought up by Senator Rand Paul. We saw that defeated by a vote. So the proceedings will formally begin the week of February 8th. The highly contagious coronavirus strain from Brazil is now in the U.S. Health officials in Minnesota announced the nation's first case on Monday. They say it was found in a patient who traveled to Brazil before becoming ill earlier this month. Officials also announced 2 new cases of the variant from the U.K., bringing the number to 8 infections in Minnesota. The state's health commissioner says the new cases reinforce the need to keep wearing masks and socially distance. Johns Hopkins University is reporting 25.3 million COVID infections in the United States, with more than 421,000 deaths. But there is some good news. The COVID Tracking Project is reporting 49 states are seeing a decline in cases. Those declining numbers prompted California Governor Gavin Newsom to make the controversial decision to lift his state's stay-at-home order. Joining us now to talk more about this is Dr. Uche Blackstock. She is a Yahoo News medical contributor and an emergency medicine physician. Dr. Welcome, great to have you with us.
Thank you.
So California's governor lifted the state's stay-at-home order because of these falling COVID numbers. But on Monday, the Minnesota Health Department announced 2 patients diagnosed with the UK variant, and they had apparently recently traveled to California. So do you think the move to lift COVID restrictions